This is the most common setup, the Roland Super Jupiter MKS-80 with its original controller, the MPG-80. But ladies and gentlemen, there's a new controller in town, the MPG-8X from Retroactive.
There's a new sheriff in town.
That's right, folks, and I'm very excited because today we're going to take a look at the MPG-8X, the brand new controller from Retroactive for the Roland MKS-80 synth module. And I'm so lucky to have both two MKS-80s in and two different MPG-8X controllers in the two different color schemes. You can get these in. Let's dig in and see what this controller can do. So let me say this right from the start, the layout here is quite different from the original MPG-80 controller. So if you're coming from that, be prepared to take a day or two to learn the differences. And after those days, I'm pretty sure you don't want to go back because there's a lot of cool features here. The main two top rows are mostly dedicated to parameter changes themselves within the synth, while the third row is where global parameters are changed like key modes, split points, loading, storing, etc. Pay special attention to the two layer buttons, the red buttons down right. With these two buttons you can control either Unit 1 or Unit 2 if you have two Super Jupiters at your disposal. So you can change all the settings on one without affecting the settings on the other. And by the way, the buttons on this controller are extremely nice. They have a springy, old-school feel to them, and it feels very satisfying just to press one and hear that click. And what I really like here is that they've created a whole new file system and storing system on this controller. You can now store tones, patches, setups, and assigns in different banks in the controller itself. So you can have your 64 patches stored within the controller in different banks as well. That's very cool, and you can even import and export those banks. I'll show you that in a little bit. The same for whole setups with Midi CCs, assigns, etc. That's very cool. And you can always decide if you want to load it into the upper or layer lower, into one unit, the second unit, or both units, depending on what type of object you're going to load in. And in my time with these controllers, this has worked very well. Like here, I want to import the whole patch bank from that MKS-80 this controller is hooked up to. So I go into the Midi menu and choose to import that bank from Unit 1 and put that in bank 2 in the controller itself. I press enter and I'm now receiving the sysex from the MKS-80. And by pressing the patch button, I can now toggle between the different banks, and in bank 2 I have those 64 patches I just imported as sysex from the MKS-80 underneath. And another cool thing, that bank can now be stored as a retroactive bank in the controller itself. And this is the physical connection I've set up to make this happen, where the controller receives both from the master keyboard and the MKS-80 itself. So most of the setups you need to do in terms of chaining units together, etc. is done from the Midi menu, where you can set input and output channels for two different units, actually toggle on the multi-unit poly mode, a chord mode, I'll get back to that, and different parameters in terms of MIDI filtering, etc. And as I showed you earlier, it's in this MIDI window you actually do all the importing, exporting, whether it's a bank, it's a patch, it's a single patch, etc. You can do it all from this MIDI window. And since I had two Super Jupiters to play with during this testing time, I found the ability to choose which one of the units I want to send something to from this controller extremely flexible and very fast. I love that feature. So this new redesigned OS by Retroactive, which I believe is going to seep through to some of their other controllers as well, I think this is the right move. I'm very happy to see that they've increased the size of the display. This OLED screen is very nice to look at in real life. It's hard to shoot actually with a camera. Anyways, in the main window, every time you touch a fader, it will reflect on that OLED screen. And you can also see what unit you're working on. So let's take another look at the bottom row where you do those global parameter changes like setting key modes, octave shifts, etc. That will follow a patch if you store that within the object type storing loading part of the controller, which I showed you earlier. So let's load in a split patch I've made up from before, the EK split 1. So I have a 4-voice tone in the lower layer and a 4-voice tone in the upper layer. And I have a split point, but I want to change that split point. So I hold down the encoder button, which is called Shift. And while holding that down, I press the split button, and now I can set that split point. And by using the octave shift buttons, I can now set the octaves as I want to. And now I can change the sounds totally independent of each other on the upper and lower layer. It's so nice having this big OLED display showing every parameter change you make. I don't even feel I have to look at the MKS-80 at all while working on it. How the MKS-80 actually works itself, well, that's for my next video. This is mostly about the controller itself, and so far it has worked very well. Let me show you a couple of examples. Now, a sign is something the retroactive controllers have had from the start, and it's a very powerful feature where you can assign different set of parameters to one fader or one expression pedal if you want to, or whatever CC device you have going. Okay, so I want that filter cutoff to be layer 1 out of 5 in total. For that, assign. I'm old school, so I like to cursor around to set minimum or maximum points, but you can also hold down the encoder button. making this a shift button, and touch any fader and it will pick up on that parameter. So you set the minimum and maximum points, pay attention to the normal or inverted mode of that fader movement. And you can then cursor up to set another layer if you want to. And I want to have more layers in this assign. So I'll cursor up and set a layer number 2. And for that, I want to automate the resonance. So I hold down the encoder button, shift, and touch resonance. And you can see the minimum and maximum values change accordingly. But I can also set this manually, and I want to invert that fader movement. And let's do one more on layer 3. I want to automate that LFO. So I go through the same procedure and do some minimum and maximum levels on that to hopefully make a little bit of a chopper sound. So what I've basically done now is that I've set up 3 different parameters with different start and end points, all assigned to that controller A fader, which will now control all these different parameters. Let's invert that cutoff. Works very well. And I can now store that assign if I want to. So I can recall that later for another sound if I want to. And remember that assigns, patches, tone, etc. can all be part of a setup you can also store. So you can store whole setups of parameters for everything in the controller itself. Very flexible and very cool to have that opportunity, especially in a live situation, for instance. So what if I want to use the mod wheel on another master keyboard, for instance, using CCs? Well, it's the same thing. I go into assign, and now I can just pick up on that mod wheel by holding the shift button, touching the mod wheel, and the controller will pick up on that CC. And now I can just set the other parameters as I want to, in this instance the filter cutoff, with minimum and maximum points, normal or inverted, etc. Just as I did on the other assign, where I assigned it to that Control A fader on the controller itself. Now it's routed to the mod wheel instead. So let's try that. It works very well, and it can be stored as well. So how about that patch generator? Well, that's something Retroactive has had in their controllers since the beginning, and they've expanded on that idea here. Let's have a look. I press the patch generator button, and I'm now in that menu. So you can choose from bass, brass, pads, strings, etc. But you can also set subcategories for what type of patch within that group you want to make. And you can also filter out different settings of parameters. So if you don't want oscillator 2 to change, you can just set that to be off. Let's try some random examples. So these can be good starting points if you want to design sounds yourself. Chord mode, well, that's a funny little thing. It's from the Midi menu. So you just enable that feature, hold down the encoder button, that is Shift, and just play those chords. And now you can play it. It can be transposed as well. Chord memory, loads of fun. I like this controller a lot. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section and I'll try to answer them as fast as I can. A big thanks to Anders Jensen and Brynjulf Blix for loaning me their MKS-80 synthesizers. I'll have more about these two chaps in the next video to come. Another big thanks to Retroactive for sending me these controllers to check out. Please check out the video description for links to where you can find the Retroactive site. As always, I'm Espen Kraft and I am the 80s. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you soon. Cheers!